Remember, Oswald had security clearance up to confidential and was working on radar systems at Atsugi Air Base in Japan that tracked the top secret U-2 spy aircraft. Angleton and his CIA hoped they could dangle the prospect of radar secrets to the Soviets as an enticement to accept Oswald as a real defector. Every indication is that the Soviets never bought the story.
Well, first of all, he didn't defect. That's one of the big lies that the CIA has been telling all these years. They've told it to the public, they told it to the State Department, but again, in their own files, it's very clear that they knew that the consul said to officially defect, you have to complete this set of papers, and Oswald never went back and completed that set of papers because he was never really intending to defect. He made a show of defecting, he never actually defected. But he did go and live in the Soviet Union, was able to move around somewhat freely. While he was in the Soviet Union, J. Edgar Hoover at one point writes a memo, and says, it seems like somebody else is using Lee Harvey Oswald's passport in the Soviet Union. I don't know what triggered that. I don't know what the follow-up on that was, but in a couple years, it was, I think, he defected in 59, the end of 1960, when they opened the 201 file. I mentioned that the official story was that it was a response from the State Department, but in fact, Oswald had also apparently written a letter to the embassy requesting, a route back to America in December at the same time this file was opened. And the man who followed James Angleton, who ran counterintelligence and who was in charge of the Oswald story, the man who followed Angleton into office, George Caleres, later wrote a memo saying that the CIA had information in December of 1960 that Oswald wanted to return to America, and that's why they opened the file. So there's actually two stories of why they opened the file. All right, let me answer that in the context of the Castro plots, because this is a really good example of the CIA going a different way from the president. And a lot of the books about the history of the CIA and the Castro plots blame Robert Kennedy, and they say he was running those plots, he authorized them. In fact, the CIA in their own documents says that is not true. They published their own Inspector General report, which they wrote in 1967. It was so closely held, only 4 people ever saw it. They wouldn't even give it to an outside typist to type up. 4 high-level people controlled this report until its release in the 1990s. And even when it was released, I think people start to read it and they read all the stuff they've heard about in other books and they give up. But if you read all the way to the end, in the last couple of pages, the CIA actually asks the question, can the CIA claim that we had executive authority for the Castro plots? And answers their own question, not in this case. And they explain that what happened is they did tell Robert Kennedy of the plots that they had stopped, of the things that they had tried that hadn't succeeded. They did not tell him, according to their own admission, of the plots that were continuing and moving forward. And when Robert Kennedy found out about these plots, he told friends not only that he got them turned off. Robert Kennedy's friend Adam Walensky says that Robert Kennedy told him that Robert Kennedy got in writing from the CIA that they would not kill Castro. And Robert Kennedy also told Dick Goodwin, who reports that, Kennedy's like, I'm the one who saved Castro, because even in his own lifetime, people were making this accusation that he had tried to kill Castro. He's like, no, I'm the guy who saved him. And so I bring this up to show that the CIA took an overt order of the president, which was to do everything you can to get rid of Castro, and they took that to mean assassination when that is not what the Kennedys meant. And you wonder how many times that happens. And so it's like you have to be very careful. And even when it became clear that that's not what the Kennedys wanted, and Kennedy was talking to people in the media, it's like doing everything he could to try and get the word out. It's like, people are asking me to kill Castro, and I don't think I should. I think that's a bad move. I don't think America should be involved in that. None of that sounds like authorization, and the CIA kind of took it upon themselves to run policy. And they do that in other ways. When the CIA goes to the president and briefs him on a country's situation, the president doesn't have his own separate set of assets there. He has no way to evaluate. All he knows is what the CIA brings him in terms of intelligence. And he hopes, and as an American, I hope, that they're getting good, unbiased, accurate information. But in the reality, the guys on the ground can shape that information any way they want to force the president's hand.
Later in 1949, Wisner established Mockingbird, a program to influence foreign media. Philip Graham from the Washington Post was recruited to run the program within the industry, and soon many of America's leading newspapers and magazines were being influenced.
This would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to two American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
Project Mockingbird really accelerated when Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president in 1952. Eisenhower's vice president was Richard Nixon, who had become known for his work in trying to prove that American government official Alger Hiss was a communist. Nixon echoed Senator Joseph McCarthy's assertions that communists were infiltrating every aspect of American life.
And I say that any man who called the Alger Hiss case a red herring isn't fit to be President of the United States. I say that a man who, like Mr. Stevenson, has poo-pooed and ridiculed the communist threat in the United States. He said that they are phantoms among ourselves. He has accused us that have attempted to expose the communists of looking for communists in the Bureau of Fisheries and Wildlife.
McCarthy's claims grew so overwhelming that on December 2, 1954, the Senate voted to censor him. Also coming into power with Eisenhower was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and, shortly after, Dulles' brother Allen, who became the first civilian CIA director. Both were Eastern establishment lawyers who had questionable dealings with Nazi officials before and after World War II, and had been accused by some with money laundering for their corporate clients. Allen Dulles personally took over and accelerated the Mockingbird project, placing CIA reports with both knowing and unknowing reporters, then watching those reports be cited and repeated throughout the media wire services. In the 1950s, some 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees were engaged in propaganda efforts.
And then they realized, the easy way to get people, to protect American business investments was to control foreign governments. And in Iran in 1953, the British had come and asked for help because Iran was making noises about nationalizing its oil that Britain was especially dependent on. U.S. was not, but Britain was. And so we worked with them to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran and install the Shah, who became a much hated figure. And the Ayatollah and the fundamentalism that we see in Iran today is a direct reaction to the Shah, who we put in, who is essentially a fascist, who ran the country like a dictator.
Flush with success with the Iran overthrow, the CIA almost immediately decided to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman of Guatemala. The United Fruit Company, in which both Dulles brothers were major stockholders, owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land in Guatemala, along with the railroad system, the telegraph system, and controlled nearly all of the country's trade. President Arbenz tried to diversify the country's agriculture and also to provide land to poor peasants. The Dulles brothers led the opposition, staging an overthrow of the Arbenz government under the guise of fighting communist expansion. The CIA's own website calls the overthrow of the Guatemalan government one of the agency's most shameful moments. Ultimately, President Eisenhower became concerned that CIA covert activities were being poorly coordinated with American foreign policy, and might even be working primarily for senior corporate interests centered on upper-class families of the Northeastern establishment. Eisenhower appointed David Bruce to investigate the agency. The report was very critical of the agency's interference into the operations of democratically elected governments. Further, the report was exceedingly critical of Operation Mockingbird. So now one of the questions that many people have about the Kennedy assassination begins to be answered. How could the facts of the murder be covered up so quickly and thoroughly? Well, the same way the American public was never told the truth about the CIA overthrow in Iran or Guatemala. It was simply business as usual with an American press that was under the direct influence of an unregulated intelligence agency with its own policy-making desires. Want a perfect example? Think about the famous Zapruder film, the best visual record of the Kennedy assassination. Life magazine publisher Henry Luce purchased the film within 48 hours of the Kennedy murder, not to show it to the public, but to lock it away for as long as possible. Why? Still not quite convinced? Well, let's look at some of the other actions of our unregulated CIA under Director Allen Dulles in the 1950s. The agency began extensive research into mind control with its MK-Ultra program, using US and Canadian test subjects, usually without their knowledge or permission. MK-Ultra tried to manipulate mental states and alter brain functions through the administration of drugs and other chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and verbal and sexual abuse. Many experiments used the drug LSD. In one series of experiments, subjects were administered LSD for 77 consecutive days. At least one death is attributed to MK-Ultra, but many more are suspected. CIA Director Richard Helms purposefully and illegally destroyed MK-Ultra files in 1973 when ordered to appear before a congressional committee. If all of this wasn't enough, the CIA got Eisenhower's permission to set up an undercover organization called Operation 40 in 1959. The infamous group included Frank Sturgis, who would become a Watergate burglar, Felix Rodriguez, a CIA operative who would murder revolutionary Che Guevara in cold blood, Luis Posada, convicted in Venezuela of blowing up a Cuban passenger airliner, and Orlando Bosch, convicted of political murder in Chile. Operating with little or no oversight, Operation 40 exploded a ship under a Belgian flag in Havana Bay, killing or injuring 275 people, mostly civilians. Over the next few years, Operation 40 would work closely with several anti-Castro Cuban organizations, including Alpha 66, the most violent of the Eisenhower-approved Cuban military groups that trained in the Everglades. Alpha 66 was a group directed by David Atlee Phillips, chief of covert action at the CIA's Mexico City station, and as we will soon see, a key CIA player in planning the assassination of President John Kennedy. In early 1962, David Phillips was so out of control that he deployed Alpha 66 in attacks on Russian ships in Cuban ports. The purpose of the provocative raids was to draw JFK into a war with Cuba. Later in 1962, Win Scott, another CIA operative, will actually send raiding parties into Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, again trying to force JFK into military conflict. So from 1953 on, we've got a CIA who controls what Americans will read through their Operation Mockingbird, a CIA who is setting their own policy of assassinations and overthrowing democratically elected governments for their own members' monetary and ideologic purposes, a CIA conducting drug and mind control experiments on American citizens without their consent. It just can't get any worse than this. Can it?
Could you tell this committee who the individuals were involving Mafia chieftains or organized crime figures?
As far as I'm aware, on that particular situation, it was William K. Harvey who was in touch with John Roselli.
It is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro.
I believe it was a hypodermic syringe they'd given him with something called black leaf number 40 in it.
In September 1960, CIA Director Allen Dulles and his Director of Operations Richard Bissell initiated talks with two leading figures of the Mafia, Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana, to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro. The plan was authorized by President Eisenhower. Later, other crime bosses such as Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Meyer Lansky became involved in the plot. The CIA offered the Mafia $150,000 to kill Fidel Castro. The advantage of employing the Mafia for this work is that it provided the CIA with a credible cover story. The Mafia were known to be angry with Castro for closing down their profitable brothels and casinos in Cuba. If the assassins were killed or captured, the media would accept that the Mafia were working on their own. We now know that the Mafia played along in order to get protection from the FBI. At least 9 plots were hatched by the CIA for Castro's assassination, but they all failed. There is every indication that President Eisenhower greatly feared the CIA corporate behemoth that he had allowed to get so out of control during his presidency, although he had done nearly nothing to rein it in. The outgoing president devoted much of his parting speech to warning America of the dangers of the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
And so it is in this atmosphere that President John F. Kennedy is inaugurated in January 1961. Kennedy leaves no doubt that he rejects the certitude of war with the Soviet Union that the military and CIA is so convinced of.
Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depth, and encourage the arts and commerce. Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free. And if a beachhead of cooperation may push back the jungle of suspicion, let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law, where the strong are just and the weak secure and the peace preserved.
But before he can begin to execute his own administration's plans for moving forward, he is confronted by the last vestige of the Eisenhower presidency, a plan for exiled Cuban refugees to invade the island hatched under Vice President Richard Nixon and CIA Director Allen Dulles.
So when Kennedy comes into office, with Cuba, he had already been essentially confronted with this Bay of Pigs operation, which had been set up during the Eisenhower administration. He had all kinds of questions about it, which Allen Dulles was very reluctant to answer. Well, the Bay of Pigs turned out to be a disaster. You know, it was, and in fact, the most recent scholarship on the Bay of Pigs says it was never really meant to succeed. And what was really meant to do was for it to fail, and then Kennedy would have to, under the pressure of defeat, he would then have to call in the Navy, which just happened to be in the area at that time, to save the day. Well, Kennedy didn't do that. And much to everybody's shock and surprise, he went ahead and accepted the defeat, right? And so, but after this, he did an investigation of the whole Bay of Pigs operation. And he came to the conclusion that he was snookered, and therefore he then fired the whole top level of the Central Intelligence Agency. This was Allen Dulles, this was Dick Bissell, who was the director of plans, and Lieutenant Director Charles Cabell.
In the 3 years he was in office, John F. Kennedy became one of the most respected and popular presidents in U.S. history. JFK reduced the tensions of the Cold War, while at the same time solidified the U.S. strategic position against the Soviets. He called on the American people to come together as a community and serve the country as a whole. He started the Peace Corps. He began a space program that led to a manned moon mission later in the decade. He worked hard to end segregation, and he prohibited discrimination in the sale or lease of housing. Kennedy successfully fought the powerful Texas oil millionaires and their representatives in Congress. He stood up and bested steel company executives when they reneged on an agreement not to inflate prices recklessly. Americans and people around the world saw his desire to stop poor people from being manipulated by powerful interests was genuine. Mostly people trusted him to champion their desire for simple fairness. Kennedy took the initiative and began a back-channel series of letter writing with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The letters led to each man understanding and respecting the other, and both men realized they were each surrounded by military advisors that understood only war. It was this personal relationship between JFK and Premier Khrushchev that quite possibly saved the world from nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The Soviets had secretly begun to build bases and deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba as a response to U.S. bases and nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy. For 13 days, military advisors on both sides pushed for confrontation, but Kennedy and Khrushchev worked out a solution that satisfied both countries and averted a nuclear catastrophe. The world credited the leaders for working out a logical, sane solution to one of the most dangerous times in world history. But military code warriors like American General Curtis LeMay accused Kennedy of cowardice, preferring a military confrontation, which he felt was inevitable.
And Kennedy learned a very, very difficult lesson during the whole Bay of Pigs thing, in that he learned that not to trust his advisors, that a lot of his advisors didn't have the same kind of interest that he did. So then during the Cuban Missile Crisis, again, he does not accept their advice because almost everybody wanted him to either invade the island or launch airstrikes against the missile silos. Well, he did neither, and in fact, he went for the least provocative solution, which was the blockade, and at the same time, he had a back channel, through his brother to the Russians, and that's the way the dispute was settled.
On November 21st, 1963, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, with its popularity at an all-time high, the President and First Lady left for their two-day Texas trip. They arrived in San Antonio, where they were greeted by a large and enthusiastic crowd. The presidential party then motorcaded to Brooks Air Force Base, where the President made a speech.
To the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity.
Then it was on to Houston, where JFK attended a testimonial dinner at Rice University Stadium honoring Congressman Albert Thomas.
Growth has meant new opportunities for this state. Progress has meant new achievements. And we dare not look back now.
And finally, on to Fort Worth, where the President and Mrs. Kennedy spend the night. President Kennedy started his final day in great spirits at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast meeting at the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas.
Just like the rest of the Texas cities JFK would visit, the crowds in Fort Worth were extremely enthusiastic. From Fort Worth, it was a short plane ride from Carswell Air Force Base to Dallas's Love Field. Plans called for the President and Mrs. Kennedy to motorcade to the Dallas Trade Mart, where JFK was scheduled to make a luncheon speech.
With some of the hundreds of people who have come here to view their arrival. And now, the President and First Lady are retreating from the fence. They're heading now for the official limousine where Governor Connolly stands, waiting their arrival so that they can make their way downtown and out to the Trade Mart.
As the presidential motorcade left Love Field, the President was unaware of certain events in and around Dallas that had taken place over the past several months regarding the man who would soon be accused of killing him.